So why don't we typically see adults crying when they see Harry Styles in the Wax Museum? The reason is because of the development of the prefrontal cortex. This photo shows a collection of neurons, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that sits right here, is obviously made up of neurons. And it's the seat of executive functioning, the prefrontal cortex is. And when you think about what executive functioning is, if you think about what an executive would do for a company, that's what this part of the brain should do for your body. And so ideally, when you walk into a wax museum and you see a wax figure of a boy band, One Direction, this part of your brain would say, number one, it's a wax figure, number two, don't cry because you're in public. And that's what that part of the brain does, because it helps plan, it helps organize, prioritize, and think about the future, and it's rational thought. And so it helps you control that emotional reaction. The neurons in that part, the neurons in general, collectively are called gray matter, because when you look at a brain, it looks sort of a dull gray color. And what we see in terms of the development of this part of the brain over time is an actual decrease in the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex that starts in early adolescence. This schematic represents, from age 5 to age 20, the changes that we see in gray matter. Gray matter is represented by purple in this diagram, and you can see gray matter volume. And so the more purple, the less gray matter there is over time. The thickness of the gray matter peaks at about age 11 in girls and about age 12 in boys, after which it starts to thin. Again, this goes back to the concept I was talking about earlier in terms of more doesn't necessarily mean better in the brain in terms of brain development. Because what happens as the cortex is thinning is that it's actually a process called synaptic pruning. And so what the brain is doing is eliminating, taking out unused connections that were either unused or unimportant, and only leaving the ones that were really, truly important. And as a result of that pruning process, what you get is a much more efficient, much more powerful system in terms of those connections. That process of synaptic pruning is essentially complete by the age of 16 in adolescence. And what that means in the real world, when we look at studies and when we talk to kids who are 16 and older, we see that they actually have cognitive capacities equal to adults in many ways in terms of understanding, reasoning, logic, memory. They seem like they're adult-like in their capacities. However, cognitive capacity does not necessarily mean, especially in terms of understanding and reasoning, does not mean that they can measure equally to adults in terms of making judgments and good judgments, especially when social, emotional factors are involved in the decision. So adolescents are much less able to utilize their cognitive capabilities that they've just developed as effectively as adults in their everyday lives when those decisions are influenced by social and emotional factors. Why? As I said before, part of the development is trying to maintain a balance between the social and emotional brain, which is still relatively more mature and stronger than the thinking brain, but also because what enables us to do that and to coordinate those judgments is connections between different parts of the brain that enable us to, again, for the frontal cortex to say, calm down, to the emotional part of the brain, or to include other aspects of other brain functions to make a more well-rounded and mature decision. There was a study that asked adults and adolescents if it's a good idea to do certain dangerous activities like swim with sharks or set your hair on fire. And what the study showed was that adolescents took longer to respond to that question. But interestingly, when you looked at their brain, what we saw was that they were actually activating fewer portions of their brain than adults were, which again sort of underscores the idea that in order to make really good judgments about things that involve potentially dangerous activities, you need to involve and coordinate larger portions of your brain. So how does that happen? What happens is that nerve cells throughout development, and even into the mid-20s, are wrapped in this material called myelin. It's a process called myelination. What myelin does is it wraps the axons of nerves, which are the long things that extend to another neuron, And when you look at a brain, again, myelin looks white, and so these are called white matter. And white matter tracts are basically the superhighways of the brain. What they are very efficient connections from one part of the brain to the other. So they connect the left part of the brain to the right part of the brain. They connect the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala and the emotional social brain. And they connect different parts of the brain in much more powerful and efficient ways. This is a really beautiful picture. That's a computer-generated picture of an actual brain. And these are white matter tracts. What it shows is that so much, and this is an adult brain, and so much of the connectivity between different parts of the brain are enabled because of this process of myelination that enables the different parts of the brain to communicate with each other much more effectively and as a whole. The reason that this is also an important new development in terms of our technology is that it can allow us to see injuries to the brain or different ways that the brain isn't developing in the way that it should as a result of injuries, various mental illnesses, as well as drug use in adolescence, which can really affect the development of white matter tracts. The brain is going to develop on its own, and there's not much we can do about that. The typical brain goes through the same process pretty much in every individual. What's really important to remember is that anyone who has the opportunity to work with youth have a tremendous amount of opportunity and responsibility in terms of providing the interactions and the opportunities to help make those connections that are so important for good, appropriate adolescent development into adulthood, and to help them not make those connections which can really cause problems for the rest of their lives. Again, it's such a great opportunity for us to be able to provide those interactions and experiences, as I talked about in terms of the dopamine connectivity and the white matter tract connectivity, which is definitely influenced by environmental influences and the role that we can play in their lives. Thank you.